Nate Geraci, who is the president of the ETF Institute. Nate, welcome to the show.
Thank you. A pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Before we kind of dive into the nitty-gritty aspect of things, give us a little bit of insight on what is it that your company does.
Sure. So we offer professional education and certification around ETFs. So we offer education on all of the foundational building blocks around ETFs, best practices on how to trade, the history of ETFs, really everything that you can think of around the ETF structure, we're educating the marketplace on.
Yeah. When it comes to education of it, there's so many different kind of resources that are out there, right? So what do you kind of specifically focus on, especially with the increasing popularities I've discussed with the other guests in terms of growth of the ETF? Because it's not just like, oh, hey, invest in the SPY, right? You've got cannabis, you've got bets, you've got AI, you've got, the future of any type of technology you want to get exposed to, you can. Even bets ETF was something that kind of came out to get exposure to the sports betting aspect of things.
Well, you bring up an interesting point because, in my opinion, ETFs are clearly the investment vehicle of the future.
Yeah.
And if you consider where most of the innovation is occurring in asset management overall right now, it's in the ETF space with some of the products you just mentioned. Well, what does that mean for investors? I always say the ETF innovation is a double-edged sword in the sense that it's been tremendous for investors. I think it's clearly a good thing overall, as it's opened up access to so many different investment strategies and asset classes that investors previously couldn't access easily and efficiently, and that's fantastic. But if you think about that innovation also has added a tremendous amount of complexity to the marketplace because investors have to understand that innovation, which isn't always easy. And that's where the ETF Institute comes in.
And what's great about it is the fact that you have something that's kind of sets you apart with the CETF designation and other certifications in the industry as well. Why do you think it's important for professionals in this field to kind of have that, especially in this space where you have a lot of gurus and furus, if you will, in the FinSwit and kind of YouTube space as well, right?
Well, again, I think it comes back to the innovation that I was just discussing. There's so many new products coming to market that I think it's important for investors and advisors to stay on top of those types of products, make sure they understand how to use them, make sure they understand how their clients use them and that they use them properly. And so I think it's important to have that foundational ETF education, which we offered, but also keep up with the changing times and the evolution in the space.
Any terms of, so with the evolution of the space, what are some emerging trends or innovations within that you kind of find exciting, right? We talked about how they need to stay on top of it. What do they need to stay on top of with what you're seeing?
It's interesting. There's just so much occurring right now. I think the one that is front of mind for a lot of investors right now is spot Bitcoin ETFs. And I don't think there's any question crypto ETFs in general are emerging trend or innovation in the ETF space. You look over the past 3 months, there's already been a net $12 billion flowing into these products. They just launched in early January. I think we're going to continue to see strong investor interest in that category. And at some point, that category is going to expand. I think we'll see spot Ether ETFs at some point, and potentially some other crypto assets as well. So I think that's one area. Another area where we're seeing a lot of innovation is actively managed ETFs. And it's interesting to me because I think when a lot of investors think about the ETF space, they automatically think index-based investments and passive investments, right? SPY and those types of products. And that's certainly true when you look at the composition of industry assets overall. But if you look over the past several years, actively managed ETFs in particular have seen outsized growth. And there have been a ton of new launches in that category. And what I find exciting is that you think about a lot of the traditional old guard, actively managed mutual fund companies, they are all now getting involved in ETFs, and they're offering their best active strategies in the ETF wrapper. So I think that's a key area to watch as well. And then I'll mention a third area, which maybe isn't quite as exciting, but still a necessary part in a portfolio, and that's bond ETFs. There has been an amazing amount of innovation in bond ETFs where we now have products that offer very surgical exposure to all areas of the fixed income market. So things like single treasury bond ETFs and single sector high yield bond ETFs, single credit rating ETFs. You can really get very precise exposure in how you invest in bonds right now.
Yeah, you mentioned bonds, and you weren't kidding. The people don't find them as exciting as some of the other in terms of Bitcoin and possibly, hopefully, if we get the ETH side of things. But I think it's great to mention because I know how to trade futures, I know how to trade stocks, I know how to trade options. Bonds is not something that I'm, fully knowledgeable in. So having exposure to that ETF is definitely something that kind of helps out the average investor have that exposure of that 80-20 mindset that we kind of grew up learning about as well. And then I know you mentioned kind of the innovation and trend side of things. I know we have our guest coming up afterwards, David, who has a music ETF. And I wouldn't have even really thought about the different companies that have exposure to that, not just from the streaming side, but also just from the label side and the concert side of things as well. Any final thoughts that you wanted to kind of discuss today, topics I didn't get a chance to bring up? The floor is all yours.
Yeah, like you mentioned David and his ETF. I know you were visiting with Dan earlier.
Yeah.
This ETF. What I think is important to convey is that when you look at the ETF space, what it has really done is open up access to, again, nearly every type of asset class and investment strategy. And from my perspective, that really boils down to three things. So it is that access, its cost, and its convenience in the ETF wrapper. And I was talking about spot Bitcoin ETFs earlier. I think that's the perfect example, because if you look at those products, they're providing access to an emerging asset class in Bitcoin, which wasn't previously available to all investors, at least in the way that they were accustomed to.
Yeah.
And if you look at the price point of those ETFs, we're talking 20, 25 basis points in annual expense ratios, which I think is remarkable. And then that last part, the convenience. These products are convenient to access, right? You can access spot Bitcoin ETFs right in your Schwab or Fidelity account or wherever you invest with a click of a button. You don't need a digital wallet or a separate account at Coinbase or some crypto exchange. It's all made easy. And I like that example because I think that's the power of ETFs. And we've seen this done year over year for the past 3 decades. The first ETF launched in 1993.
Yeah.
And we're still seeing that innovation. And so again, something like the music ETF, I think is a good example. That's a thematic ETF. If you want to get exposure to that category, it allows you to do so. So I think that's the key here. It's that ETFs offer access at a low cost, and there's that convenience factor.
Yeah, anytime I tell my friends, they're like, oh, hey, like, what should you invest in? I'm always scared because, one, I'm not certified. I don't do this at a professional level to that degree. So I'm always afraid. But what I always say is, hey, if you believe in AI, if you believe in the future of music, if you believe in the future of any type of sector, here are the different ETFs that you can add to your portfolio. That way you're diversified. And the only way you're wrong long-term is if the technology and the idea that you believed was incorrect, and not necessarily because one company didn't execute on the idea that was great, but the execution was just below. Yeah,
100% agree. The challenge, though, is there are now over 3,400 ETFs, which gets back to what we were discussing earlier.
Yeah.
I don't want to belabor the point, but it's that education, understanding how you go about filtering through those 3,400 ETFs, what you need to look for when you're conducting due diligence. That is extremely important. So it's very exciting times in the industry, but like I said, the complexity level has also come up as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's the downside of innovation is as you have more folks involved, sometimes you lose a little bit of quality. But I really appreciate your time today, man. Thank you so much for hopping on.
Yep, thank you for having me.